The real soldiers are all gone, Cenn thought, off fighting in a real battle at the Shattered Plains. No wonder Kaladin wants to get his squad there.
Welcome to The Storming Journey, a sacred text reading of The Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. This podcast may contain spoilers for The Stormlight Archive through Wind and Truth.
Hi, I'm Elle, and I'll be the Ardent for this episode as we cover Chapter 1 of The Way of Kings.
I'm Adam, and I'm today's Worldsinger.
And I'm Liz, I'm the Veristitalian.
So my world singing today is about a time, rather recent time. So right now I'm in grad school, and when you get accepted to grad school, which was about 4 years ago for me, which is feels long, but like it feels like yesterday at the same time. But when you get accepted into grad school, they usually fly you out so that you can kind of get to know the department, get to know the people, meet people who are interested in your work so that you can kind of make a decision if you get into multiple grad schools. And I was flown out to the University of Connecticut, and they had their little orientation. And the world thing I want to focus on is when I met my advisor. Before entering into my PhD program, I had my undergrad, and then I got a different master's. And in both of those programs, my advisors were not very invested in the ideas that I was putting forward. I think they were invested in me as a human being, but they weren't very interested in the different ideas that were coming to me from the science fiction I was reading, from the fantasy that I was reading, because those are things that aren't always accepted in an academic conversation. When I got to UConn, my advisor, Kathy Knapp, walked right up to me and she's like, I am so interested in your idea for your dissertation. I am so interested in, where you're going with this idea of dystopia and this idea of sexual justice and this idea of how dystopia relates with the world around us. And she invested herself in that moment in me as a human being and me and my ideas, not just me as a human, but me and my ideas that I was putting forward. And that relates to the books, and it relates so much to me is when Cenn feels that acceptance from the people around him. When Dalet's like, we paid money to get you here. We wanted to save you. And specifically, I thought about the line when Cenn thinks, what? Why would anyone pay to get me? And he's wondering, just as I was wondering in that moment, how amazing this is that someone finally is invested in my ideas as a human being and invested in my ideas for my dissertation. So I think that for me connects really well to this moment with Cenn also having that moment where it's like someone finally wants him and wants him to be a part, especially for him in a time of war, which is a lot more heavy than a time of grad school.
I don't know, academia is war. So I'm going to give us the storm's eye view of this chapter. So a youth named Cenn fears he will die in his first battle. Lucky for him, he's on the squad of Kaladin Stormblessed, who has a reputation for protecting those who serve under him. Another soldier named Dalet explains that Kaladin occasionally pays for inexperienced soldiers to be transferred to his unit. Cenn is dragged through the chaotic battle, being protected by Kaladin's squad. He gets stabbed in the leg when he's briefly separated from the group, but Kaladin finds him and rescues him. Just as the battle appears to be ending, a shard bearer appears on the field and Cenn faints. By implication, he's dead.
So you're saying, though, that Cenn has a moment of zen.
Yes, yes. A moment where he realizes you can't fight a shard bearer.
So I had a little bit of trouble coming up with a theme for this chapter. But what I finally landed on was responsibility. And part of it is because I thought the cold open quote, the part that specifically says the real soldiers are all gone, was really fascinating to me. And it felt like it encapsulated a lot of the Stormlight Archive experience of the real soldiers are always someone else. Like for Kaladin, it's, well, the regional soldiers here aren't real soldiers, so they're the ones on the Shattered Plains. Well, Sadeas's soldiers aren't real. Dalinar's are. And then even Dalinars aren't real compared to the heralds, who aren't even necessarily real soldiers compared to like the shards. And then kind of the question of like, who is a real soldier? And it seems that throughout a lot of this, a real soldier is one who takes responsibility for their actions, which I think is seen in Kaladin's hatred for the Light Eyes and the fact that he feels like the Light Eyes are absolved of their responsibilities or don't take responsibility for their actions. But then specifically, I was thinking about how Cenn's thought process in this chapter models the arc of the Stormlight Archive, in that Cenn originally blames himself for like his situation. He says like, why did I leave the fields or whatever he was doing before? And then he blames the officers to some extent for a lack of training. He's like, I wasn't trained for this. I wasn't trained for this specific situation. The training I've received is useless here. And then at the very end, he says, when he's talking about his own eventual death, why would you fight the Almighty? And he kind of blames God at the end for his situation, his death. And for me, or I see it in the Stormlight Archive, the arc of the first half, we see individuals blaming themselves for event, whether that's Shallan or Kaladin or Dalinar. And then they end up feeling like the responsibilities on the heralds. The heralds were the one that messed this up because of how they formed or broke or manipulated the Oath Pact. And then by the end of Wind and Truth, it feels like they've placed the responsibility for the state of the world on the shards. So I think it's a really good opening chapter to like present those themes of responsibility that show up throughout the book. And I'm curious how y'all saw those themes throughout your reading.
I was thinking about, obviously, Kaladin's version of responsibility in this chapter is responsibility for the individual lives of the people around him, which is a great attitude to have if you're in charge of people's life and death situations, right? But then I kind of flashed forward and remembered the situation with the bridge crews, right? When he does the side carry and he's not thinking about his responsibility towards the overall battle. And I think the same thing is probably happening here. Like, Kaladin is not thinking about his responsibility towards Amaram, whose army he's serving in, whose goals he's supposed to be helping accomplish. He's decided that he doesn't care about his responsibility towards Amaram for probably good reasons. Amaram's not a great person, as we shall find out. But that he cares more about his responsibility downwards than upwards, I guess. He's more caring about his responsibility to the people underneath him than to the people over him.
He sees the Light Eyes as having failed in their responsibility. So, like, if Kaladin has the highest level of a dark-eyed responsibility, then he assumes none of the Light Eyes are going to watch out for him and aren't going to take... He's already seen how Light Eyes are not taking responsibility for him. So why should he feel responsible to them? And, like, I mean, that's a valid point. Like, I don't think he's necessarily wrong, but it does make for situations like with the bridge crews and the side carry where he puts the entire group at risk because he's not trusting that responsibility exchange.
I think there's some like layers of responsibility coming out here as we talk, right? There's responsibility when you're like devoted to someone or to something. So you feel that sense of responsibility. And with Kaladin, I always think about how his responsibility is driven by the fact that he thinks he got his brother killed, right? Because of how eventually his brother joined the war, yada, yada. And his brother's death is something that derives that responsibility. And I think whenever we think about someone's need to be responsible, we have to think through like what is the back part of it, which doesn't undermine them acting responsible or being considered responsible. But at the same time, like Kaladin's driver to connect to all of, it's like his reason for grabbing Cenn is because Cenn reminds him of his younger brother. not because Cenn needs to be saved as a human being. That's still there, right? I think that's still like a driver of that responsibility and that feeling responsibility, but it's more a guilt over, oh, I lost my brother and I need to try to gain some form of forgiveness by saving all the little younger men that I can.
Yeah. I also kind of read this theme of responsibility as how do we have responsibility in a chaotic world? Because the battlefield is a great metaphor for life, right? There's things happening that you have no control over. You're involved in systems that you didn't start and that you can't stop or change. So how do we choose to have responsibility rather than like Cenn saying, oh, it's somebody else's fault that I don't have the training? And I think one thing we get through this is that Kaladin is able to make meaning for the people in his squad by taking responsibility and giving them a purpose and saying, this is what we're going to be responsible for. We're responsible to each other, and we're going to organize the chaos in such a way that we don't focus on the things that we can't control, that we don't have responsibility for, and we focus just on following the signals from each other and being responsible for our small organization that we can comprehend.
Yeah, I think they talk about that in kind of like the world of activism. It is often more effective to find a singular organization for you to be a part of with a singular cause that you can be involved in, rather than saying, I'm going to participate in every single thing, or I'm going to be a part of an organization that addresses every single social issue that I care about. But picking one thing to like make your place in the world and make a difference for that group of people or in that specific area. And I think that's really valuable to help keep the chaos from feeling out of control. Like we talked about the weight of history in the first episode of like how overwhelming that can feel. And I think you really feel that in this chapter of how overwhelming it can feel without something to guide you or to be intentional about, to be responsible for, as long as it's not the whole thing. Like be responsible for your small unit, your small family, your small organization.
One thing I love about what's coming out of this conversation is that responsibility is not something that's external to you. It's about the relationships that you form. And that comes out really well in Kaladin's relationship to his crew, his crew's relation, or not crew, but like his, what are they called? Squad. His squad. Crews for the Mistborn podcast, which will come about in 40 years. No. It's the relationships that give the responsibility. Right, Kaladin, between the squad, they are all responsible for each other, and it's not something that's external to them. It's not forced upon them by Kaladin. It's just because they want to be responsible for each other. So there's a sense of agency and responsibility, and this sense of a networked relationship that I really like that we're pulling out, because it makes responsibility no longer an innate thing. You're no longer automatically responsible for something, and so it makes it a choice. And then it's also something that's not quite external for you. You're not being told you have to be responsible for that. You are saying, I am going to be responsible for this and form this connection and this relationship. Just as I think Cenn gets a little, and about halfway through the chapter when he is trying to find his way back to his squad and he finds that other squad that's a different squad, right? He's formed that relationship connection that makes him responsible for that squad. It makes the squad responsible for him. And it's this formation of those networks and that relationship between that like creates the responsibility in many ways.
I was listening to a podcast episode this morning talking about the breakdown of civil society in America. But this academic was pointing out that one of the reasons that might be is because it is difficult for us to feel responsibility towards a group that gets over a certain size. Township democracy works well when you can know the 200 people in your town and you all feel responsible to each other for the results of what you do. But when we get into a society of millions, or even billions as our interconnected society across the globe, all of us are interacting with each other. It's more difficult to feel responsible to an abstract group of millions of people than it is to feel responsible to these small people whose faces I can see and who I can get to know. It says the battlefield broke down into hundreds of small groups, right? There's no one who can comprehend this whole battle and see how it's really working. It's the small groups that it basically becomes this small group versus that small group. And in there, it's one man versus one man, right? There is nothing really existing on this larger scale. It's all at the smaller scale.
Adding on to that, it's interesting too that like a battlefield still has someone who's responsible over it, has the battle leader who has to make these really difficult decisions of where am I going to send these young men to go die or these young women to go die, right? It's forget the philosopher, I think it's Agamben, who creates the Homo Sacer, which are the humans who can be sacrificed in the front line of war, those that do not have as much, say, humanity in them to be considered equal humans. And so you can put them in front of you and sacrifice them, whereas there are other special humans. And I think that like troubles a little bit. And one thing that's really great that Sanderson's focusing on this symbol of war as like one of the central themes throughout Stormlight Archive, because it really helps us see that relationship of what makes human, right? Kaladin sees all of his local squad members as humans. Later on in the book, he thinks of Dalit over and over and over again. And I think there's moments where he also even thinks of Cenn after knowing him for what? 2 minutes?
30 seconds?
Yeah.
We got Dalit saying, go pee on a rock, and then Kaladin comes in and says, where is he? Oh, hey, new guy. And then that's it. But he still thinks of him later on, right? And that connection, I really like that you brought in that idea of when you're closer to things, that you form really strong responsibility connections versus that bigger picture that we get through Dalinar later in the story, that we get through Jasnah later in the series, right? Of I have to make these really big, really tough decisions for thousands and hundreds of people that I am responsible for.
Yeah, and how do I make that decision that seems heartless at an individual level? Like, that's what trips Jasnah up in the final Battle of Wits, is like, no, I'm not willing to actually make that decision because I'm going to protect the people I have a relationship with. Yeah, and that's how we get all sorts of problems in our world where people are not accountable for their decisions, and then those decisions at a corporate level cause problems because we don't have these responsibility relationships, and no one person is responsible for it. My husband's a computer programmer, and so I think of like when you're in a small startup, you can know the entire code base, right? You can understand everything that makes your product do what it does. He's worked at big companies, so you get to the level of a Microsoft or Amazon. No one actually knows everything that this code does. You only know your small bit, and you try to take responsibility for that, but there's no one taking responsibility for the whole of it because it all interacts together without anyone intending it to.
My husband's in the exact same situation of software engineer at a very large company where we're going to focus on this entirely small little section because no one can like even contain the whole like thought of what all this does in their head at one time. I think the chaos of this lends itself really well to moving to one of our optional segments, the Artifabrian Journal. Sanderson, in the early years of his career especially, had a lot of annotations of his chapters. And they're fascinating to read. I believe they exist for at least some of the early era One Mistborn books, completely for Warbreaker, and then the first part of Way of Kings. So I thought I would take advantage of that and kind of look at what he said about this first chapter. And he talks about the fact that the book starts with 3 non-viewpoint characters, which is like what his editors basically told him, that's going to be really hard for your readers. Are you sure you want to do that? But it felt appropriate. He wanted to do it. And one of the reasons that he wanted to not start with Kaladin's perspective is because he said he didn't want the first chapter to feel in control. And in this first chapter, Kaladin is feeling in control and is feeling like he can be responsible for things, whereas Cenn does not feel in control. He is a 15-year-old, and I remember being 15. I did not feel in control of my own life, let alone what I could do on a battlefield. And he also uses the first chapter to play with many fantasy tropes. Like he talks about how Cenn, in a different series, may have been the Kaladin. And Kaladin in an earlier version was more like Cenn, where he would overcome all of these challenges and turn out to be the main character. And I just thought that was really an interesting literary technique to be intentional about. And I think we felt that as we read it. I felt like I did experience a lack of control to some extent.
Yeah, and I was thinking about also the title of the book, The Way of Kings, right? This chapter does not give us the way of a king. It gives us the way of your average foot soldier. And I think that is a fantasy trope that he's definitely playing with, that often these epic fantasies focus on the people who are making decisions at a high level, and then the epic hero who can fight the entire battle by himself. We don't often see the small people who are not responsible for the war. They're not responsible for making strategic decisions. And the way that the decisions that are made by our main characters later are going to affect people like Cenn. And that's where he's starting us out with like the way of the foot soldier.
Yeah.
I think as well, it pulls in a lot more the humanity with it that's in the book. And I always think about one thing that he taught in his lecture series about how whenever you're about to do something really big, always switch to a random character who's like on the wall. So you get a scene in a different book where someone's about to do something really big and you switch to a guard on the wall who gets like kicked in the face, or I don't remember exactly what happens. But that switch allows you to take a breath as the reader, allows you to get a different perspective. And I think it's interesting because pulling in that it's the start of the book, right? We quite don't need a breath yet. But you think about it, we kind of do need a breath between the prelude, the prologue, and then going into Kaladin's Depressi, to say it nicely. Mm-hmm. It's his little sad, that we're going to get in the, next 40 chapters of Kaladin being sad boy. Love sad boy. But I think it is kind of that breath, though, of going to Cenn after getting Kalak's big, as we talked about in the first episode, his big, like, struggle of being human after living for X amount of years, and then going to Seth killing people indiscriminately and just rejecting his entire humanity to go to this little kid who is at the central of it. I think it does still do that thing that he does whenever he goes to a different character before something big happens or before a different event, to provide that other experience. You can always think about that other experience. Always think about the guard on the wall as the person moves through the keep killing everyone. Always think about that other moment. And in Way of Kings, structurally, it comes in a lot with the interludes, with he does still go to random characters and things like that right before moments, and that like gives you that breath to recognize what's happening, but also to see the more complexity of humanity within it.
Maybe to contribute to the chaos, we are going to move to our sacred reading, which today is Bibliomancy. It's described by Wikipedia as the diviner selects a book that is believed to hold truth. They open it at a random page and place their finger in a random place on that page. They then read the one or two sentences they find themselves pointing to. So when I grew up, we did not call this Bibliomancy. We just did it, but it was a common thing for at least, not officially, this was not a LDS members should all do Bibliomancy. This was a passed from youth to youth.
It's a folk practice.
This is a folk practice of opening up your scriptures to a random page and finding the verse and having that be an answer to your question. I don't know that I have a particular question, but I do think I want to approach this as I am going to open it up and see if I can find meaning in this random sentence that I'm going to.
Or are we doing 3 different ones?
I don't know, actually.
I think it's got to be personal with bibliomancy.
Okay, we're going to be personal about it. So everyone's going to find their own. It's just a question of whether we want to like do them simultaneously and then talk differently.
I think taking one at a time.
Okay, Liz, why don't you go first?
Okay, this is what I landed on. Cenn didn't even know who the enemy was. A landlord was encroaching on Bright Lord Amaran's territory, the land owned ultimately by High Prince Sadeas. And let's see, how can I apply this to my life? I think, given the current political situation of the United States, sometimes it's hard for me to know exactly who the enemy is, right? There's so much chaos going on at different levels that it's a complex problem, and you don't know where we need to go to solve the problem. I think that's definitely a feeling that I'm having right now in my life is I don't know who the enemy is. I'm trying to pinpoint what went wrong to get us to this point is difficult.
And like, it might be like a step away from something else. Like this is Amaram's territory, which belongs to Sadeas. And so it's like, well, is this a city problem that's being solved at a federal level, but should actually be a state issue? Or like, where do I need to get involved?
How far back do we need to travel on the dominoes to find who's responsible and how to fix it?
Right. Yeah. It's overwhelming. It's not fun.
Yes.
I think that also, though, like ties into it, because it's like, is the enemy the people who are causing it, or is it the enemy who are the people right in front of you? Or are the people right in front of you just other human beings who are also being affected by this? Right? Because if you think about the enemy...
Which is a theme that we'll come back to.
Yeah, but like, is it the enemy army, or is it the enemy Bright Lord who's causing the army to be in front of you? Going all the way back to what you were saying earlier, Liz, about the being able to be responsible and respectful of a more communal local polity rather than a national polity, right? Like, I think that kind of provides in some way an answer to thinking, because it ties back, right? Cenn didn't even know who the enemy was. A landlord was encroaching him, but then he knows who Bright Lord Amarim is. He knows who Sadeas is. And so it's like those figures he knows, but he doesn't know if the people in front of him are the enemy. And I think that question there is really generative to approaching life in this very politicized and polarized world that we live in, right? The enemy is usually not the person right in front of you.
I accidentally just went to the same page.
I did too. Oh my gosh. All right, I'm redoing mine now. No.
Redo.
Can we redo this? Or could we have that?
Yes, I redid mine. So I got, this squad is different, Cenn said, not because of luck, because of training. Dalek goes on to say that's part of it, and then adds like some other info about Kaladin. And I think that, to me, feels really important to note that, like, I think there is an aspect of luck, like whether or not something is super successful is partially due to luck, but also due to the effort and training that you put into it. I am a huge Taylor Swift fan. And I think a lot about how a lot of like Taylor Swift's acclaim and like benefits from like financial benefits come from directly from the work that she has done and the community that she has fostered, and the building of that community that she has encouraged. And while there was definitely elements of luck or elements of training or elements of how her parents helped her, a lot of it is due to her own skill and like her own ability to write really good music. Which is not like it's a personal connection insofar as I'm a huge Taylor Swift fan. But I just think that like we do talk about the importance of hard work and the importance of luck in achieving things. But I think it's important to not let the hard work go unacknowledged or unnoticed, even when there is luck involved. Or privilege.
Just add that as a casual addition.
We're not going to unpack that. Let's move on.
No, we don't have time to unpack all of
What?
that.
Yes.
Okay, I landed on the line is just then the larger body of Amaranth's force broke, the men scattering. That's the line. There's more to the paragraph, so I'm going to read a little bit more. So Cenn hadn't realized how poorly the battle in this quarter had been going for his side. As Kaladin's team retreated, they passed many wounded and dying, and Cenn grew nauseated. Soldiers were sliced open, their insides spilling out. Gruesome near the end there, but I want to focus in this moment on how Cenn's like so in the moment that he didn't realize what was happening around him, and relating that back to the theme of responsibility and to that topic, right? He's so focused on doing the thing that he is responsible for, standing with a spear in the middle of the squad, that he doesn't see like the forest from the one tree, to use the philosophical phrasing. And the thing is, he also doesn't realize how poorly it's going. And I think in a personal life, when you're very responsible for the things around you, you can get so focused on fulfilling that responsibility without seeing that broader aspect. We brought up over and over again the bridge crews and how Kaladin's moment of being responsible to his bridge crew caused that entire battle and more lives to die, probably more lives than what was in his bridge crew to die in that moment in that war, right? Which is why I think war is such a fascinating thing to have as a central aspect of this entire series. Really, the entire cosmos of Roshar is war, right? Because of that fighting between honor and odium. Cultivation's just there. No, just kidding. Cultivation's a part of it too, right? But I think what we're pulling out here and what I'm thinking through is how when I get so focused on something, I can forget the larger aspect of it. When I'm so focused on like helping someone in my department get something, I can lose the bigger picture. Not that I'm responsible for that bigger picture, but just that I don't take the moment to stop and think, is what I'm doing good more generally? Or is what I'm going to do if I end up doing it bad? So thinking about consequences in relationship with being responsible for certain things is what I'm pulling out from that paragraph.
All right, so it is now time for the wisdom of the Herald. And what you feel like you want to come away with, whether that's something you want to change or a way you're thinking about things differently from this episode. I think for me, thinking about responsibility, I sometimes get overwhelmed by the amount of responsibility I have in certain aspects. And I will often take on new responsibilities in a different area because I don't want to deal with the responsibilities in that area. And I think it may be important for me to take some time to think about what responsibilities I am ignoring in favor of taking on new ones, and whether or not those new ones, first of all, whether the original responsibilities were worth holding on to. Is that something that I do actually need to be responsible for? And then whether the new responsibilities are worth introducing. Because my time is limited and my energy is, to use a Taylor Swift phrase, expensive. And I want to make sure that I am not abandoning responsibilities that other people are relying on me for in more important ways than the ones I am picking up.
My wisdom also kind of relates to that, since it's about thinking about that broader picture for my own life whenever I take on a responsibility or for the responsibilities that I have. And whether that taking on that responsibility is affecting that broader life. So always trying to get the bird's eye view of my life specifically, not of other things that I don't have responsibility over. So like my job or things like that. Because like the people above me have responsibility for that bigger picture. But in my life, the things that I'm doing, the things that I'm taking on, I'm responsible for them. And that affects my trajectory in life a lot more. It affects like how I'm seen, but also how I experience and love life, right? Which I love my life, even though there's a lot of responsibility in there. But I think thinking more about, is this going to help provide a better, bigger picture for me when I take on a responsibility, or if I need to leave a responsibility and kind of like let it go to the side.
My thought is that in my life, I'm both Kaladin and Cenn, right? Sometimes you have to be the person who has the bigger view for your group. Kaladin's got this plan to get them to the Shattered Plains, and this particular battle is part of that. So I do my weekly planning. I figure out what I need to accomplish in order to move forward on my responsibilities. But then sometimes you also just have to be focused in the moment that you're on and not get overwhelmed with the whole battle like Cenn does when we have the initial charge, and Cenn is just like, this is chaos. I don't know what I'm doing. And it's easy to freeze and not be able to accomplish the things that you need to be responsible for. But if you can get focused into that moment that like, we're just protecting this little hill. I'm just doing this one task right now, and I don't have to worry about the scope. I will worry about that later. And focus on the small things that I can do right now and really do those well. I think they can help me feel less stressed out about the responsibilities that I have. Thank you for joining us today on The Storming Journey. You can support our work on this podcast by subscribing to our Patreon, leaving a review, or sharing the podcast with a friend. We hope you'll join us next week, and in the meantime, remember, journey before destination.